In response to the desperation of the few that have no alternative but to join terrorist organizations, society cold-heartedly dismisses them with silence, with the veil of complicity. In response to the structural issues that pertain within terrorist organizations, members at the top of our social hierarchy respond with silence, with legal punishments and punitive measures that are void of any meaning. Imprecise justice is permanent injustice. We're very proud to stand on OG. Two pieces of framing at the top of this speech. First, why do people join or attempt to join terrorist organization in the status quo? Firstly, we think this because of things like ideological beliefs, that many individuals in society, especially in societies with highly oppressive governments, are drawn to terrorist organizations due to shared ideological beliefs. Secondly, due to things like perceived injustice, that feelings of injustice, discrimination, or oppression and marginalization can drive people to seek outlets where they believe they can fight against their perceived oppressors, which are oftentimes governments or other governments that exist in things like proxy wars. Third, because of things like social networks, that things like family ties, or the fact that there oftentimes exists a lot of people proximate to you within these terrorist organizations, or why people are influenced to join these organizations in the first place. And fourthly, and perhaps sometimes most importantly, things like economic factors, that these are people that are lured mainly due to things like financial incentives, things like promises of payment or employment, and access to resources that are oftentimes scarce, especially if you're a socioeconomic minority that is the bottom of the social hierarchy. Secondly, then, how would this act of decriminalization look like compared to the status quo on our side? We would clearly differentiate between intent and action, that joining a specific terrorist organization or being part of that terrorist organization is no longer necessarily considered as a legal wrong, that the legal ramifications would no longer exist. But the clear difference then, and the bar that side opposition ought to meet in this round, is that we would still punish people that are part of those organizations, but create more harm in society. So things like participating in missions that harm democratic measures, that harm specific people within minority states. These are types of things we would still punish, or things that we would consider as something that is legally punishable, but merely joining these programs or joining these organizations in and of itself isn't necessarily going to be considered as legally punitive. We would also support things like early intervention programs, given that these legal programs can exist. So instead of immediately resorting to criminal charges, we would rather have a status quo or counterfactual in which authorities would establish early intervention programs and things like risk assessment that exist in the current legal system for other purposes as well. First argument on rehabilitation. The premise of this argument is very simple, that when we decriminalize the act of attempting to join, or the fact that you have joined a terrorist organization, allows us to shift our social focus on things like rehabilitating these individuals, considering the structural issues and the reasons why they ought to have joined these terrorist organizations in the first place. We treat individuals as potential subjects for de-radicalization, rather than focusing them and branding them as a social outlet, as criminals that we ought to separate from society. This is, for example, things like rehabilitation programs that exist in Europe, such as in countries like Denmark, where they focus on early intervention and rehabilitation of specific individuals who have publicly expressed interest in joining extreme groups or extremist groups and politically radical groups. These are people that are oftentimes counseled, educated, and receive vocational training so that they're able to rehabilitate into society. This is not offered and socially not supported, again, due to things like optics and perception of criminals, largely by society in the status quo, because they're branded as specific people that are radical, that are not likely to have changed because of the fact that they're criminalized. But also not independent from optics, if they are criminalized, it means that their opportunities in the future, even if they have made the mistake of merely joining a terrorist organization, would lead to them being unable to change their lifestyle, which means that they oftentimes have to resort back to these terrorist organizations, given their scarce and dire situations. The impact of this is very, very simple, that even if it is true that opposition might claim, I'm going to preempt this, that sure, this law is why less people want to join terrorist organization. Our claim is very simple. Those laws oftentimes do not work because people have further extreme motivations, like I point out at the top of my framing. So what is best to do in this specific circumstance is not isolate them and brand them as criminals, but more likely reintegrate them back into society that we can do through our resources. Before I talk about the second argument, how we generally decrease terrorist activity that is far more pernicious when it is underground, I'll take a POI from preferably closing, but also open. Okay, seeing none, lack of engagement. Second argument on decreasing terrorist activity. Apart from individual reintegration, the premise of this argument is that criminalization oftentimes means people that are most likely going to join these terrorist organizations due to the structural issues likely go underground, making it even harder and more challenging for government intelligence agencies to gather crucial information and data, specifically about the inner workings of these organizations. There are four layers of argumentation why this is true. First layer, in terms of enhanced intelligence gathering. Why, if you focus on encouraging specific recruits to come forward without immediate fear of criminal charges, so the fact that you might be legally punished, you can significantly enhance intelligence gathering efforts to knock down specific locations of terrorists. If you're someone that has joined a terrorist organization, in the status quo, you have the fear of being associated and completed with that terrorist organization, which can lead to you getting damages legally. But if that is decriminalized, more people would have the incentive to publicly come out and support these intelligence gathering measures. Layer two, in terms of infiltrating terrorist networks. Now, when individuals feel that they won't be immediately branded as criminals, they might be more willing to provide information that can help specifically law enforcement infiltrate terrorist networks. That is very important because we can prevent acts of terrorism, because timely information from individuals, given that terrorism is oftentimes time sensitive and focuses on the magnitude of impact that we ought to care about in the scale of urgency, is important, because people that have intended to join terrorist organizations but have joined and regretted the choice have been the main stakeholder of this debate, given that they have not done any specific action that has caused or increased terrorism in society, are most likely able to help authorities prevent potential attacks. We can point to examples such as Australia, such as things like the Project Bench, or specific instances in Saudi Arabia, where a lot of people that have joined terrorist organizations due to structural reasons, but have regretted it and want to come out, are able to help more and help governments locate these terrorists so they are no longer minorities in the future. At the end of the day, not only have we proven to you, but this leads to individuals being able to reintegrate back in society as an independent reason for people being generally happier, but society being generally safer. We've also pointed out to you why the association with legal punitive measures means that it is harder for us to track down on terrorists, track down on people that have crucial intelligence gathering that can lead to social progress in the status quo. Very proud to stand on OG, because imprecise justice is permanent injustice.
We believe with the current threats that exist of terrorist attacks, we believe that it is most important for us to continue what we've been doing in the status quo and continue to take a preventative approach towards these potentially dangerous actions. So first of all, I'd be like to review against what the opening opposition first speaker has presented. Then I'll be moving on to my two pieces of substantive regarding how we believe it is the government's responsibility to protect civilians from potential terrorist actions, and second of all, how this can prevent the influence and spreading of these terrorist ideologies. So first of all, onto refutation. The opposition has essentially provided this alternative of rehabilitation and helping people to reintegrate into society based on structural issues. I have a few responses to this, which I'll also be expanding on further in my substantive. First of all, we believe that most of the people who do intend to join terrorist organizations do so recognize that, oh, this is something that's not normal, that this is something that could be potentially essentially detected by the government, and something that I don't want people to find out because essentially sets me apart from society. So therefore, we believe that it is extremely unlikely for people understanding these things to essentially publicly announce or like in the engage in public actions, even if they do decriminalize these actions, because of the innate knowledge that being in a terrorist organization is not normal, and because of the existing societal backlash towards these individuals, which will, by the way, not cease to exist just because you decriminalize it. So therefore, we believe it will be extremely difficult to essentially help people to reintegrate in society, because it is going to be difficult to detect the future harm in the first place. Furthermore, we believe that for most of the people who have chosen to join, because of the extremely extreme nature of these terrorist organizations, many people who have joined, as the opposition has admitted themselves, have these deep-seated beliefs regarding the government. Therefore, we believe it is extremely unlikely of them, being these organizations that basically oppose the government in most ways, to actually be able to accept help and want intervention from the government. So therefore, we believe this is another reason why they would not be likely to announce their intentions publicly, with the fear of getting targeted for rehabilitation by the government, which they do not trust. I'll take your POI. No, okay.
Yeah, POI.
Yeah.
Your own analysis in your speech as to why there are deeply entrenched structural issues, as to why people join terrorist organizations, is why even in the status quo with these laws, people continue to join these terrorist organizations and oftentimes stay in these organizations. The difference between the two sides is that on our side, we have more chances for rehabilitation, and we also crucially get more intelligence that can save more people's lives.
Yeah, I'll address that later. But I just like to first of all point out that we believe that forcing them with like real harms that can actually affect them, for example, like legal punishments for themselves or people around them, is going to be a more effective deterrent and preventative measure. So now they've also stated that essentially it'll be more difficult to detect because of for law enforcement agencies. First of all, we believe that as I've already said before, people recognize that being in a terrorist organization is something that is not going to be normally accepted by society, and therefore are going to be unlikely to share information with the knowledge that anything they share could potentially be harmful. And furthermore, we believe that already bargaining strategies within the legal system, for example, telling a terrorist, oh, we will lessen your punishment if you tell us X and Y information. Furthermore, we believe that even if they go underground, we believe this is also important for social messaging, to essentially by enclosing the network information, we prevent more people from essentially being exposed to this information and therefore joining these terrorist organizations and causing them to expand, which I'll also be discussing in my second piece of substantive. So now with that in mind, I'll be moving on to my first point regarding how we believe that taking preventive measures towards terrorist groups is going to be beneficial. So therefore, I'd like to, with this in mind, I'd like to make a characterization of terrorist groups. We believe they are essentially groups that transcend normal societal norms, for example, societal morals or societal values, often willing to go to extremes, especially violently skewed actions, in order to achieve what they perceive to be the right goals that they want. And therefore, in this way, they differ greatly from normal protest organizations because they are often skewed to more violent and extremist methods. This means that for the people who join, they often align to, for people to wish to join, they often have to align with these ideas to a large degree to choose to join a terrorist organization, which is known for these extreme ideologies and extreme actions, instead of, for example, a lesser or less dangerous like society. So therefore, we believe that these people are going to be basically the extreme people in society who align with these to a more than normal extent. Otherwise, they would not be willing to essentially sacrifice potential dangerous actions in order to join these known to be violent groups. So therefore, we believe there is a huge risk associated with these people. First of all, we believe that with these people joining, they have the potential to magnify future terrorist actions and generally spread these ideologies and propaganda and network information to other people, causing basically the network to sprawl and spread. And furthermore, even if they have not committed any negative actions thus far, according to the government team, this is no guarantee that they will not be dangerous in the future because they are already following these dangerous ideologies. And by joining these organizations, are further exposed to the connections. Will not be taking any more POIs, and are further exposed to the connections and the actions regarded associated with terrorist organizations, which pushes their chance of committing terrorist actions much higher in the future. Which means that there is a high risk associated with these individuals. However, we as the opposition are sole stakeholders that are able to prevent this. First of all, as I've already characterized, we believe that rehabilitation is not going to work, firstly because of the innate distrust they have towards the government and the deep-seated ideologies. However, if we provide them with some physical deterrents that can actually have a measurable impact to their lives, for example, being sentenced to jail for a certain degree of time, we believe that the knowledge they're putting punishment onto themselves or their family potentially by joining these groups is going to be the best deterrent. And by leveraging legal consequences, we are able to provide them with a physical reason not to do these actions, instead of just the thought that, oh, if I join, I'll just get some rehabilitation, but I won't change my ways in the end. Furthermore, we believe that essentially seeing other terrorists get arrested essentially spreads the social deterrents to other people that these terrorist organizations are obviously not a good thing, and joining them comes with a lot of associated risks, and therefore will it essentially prevent many people from joining these in the first place, and also dramatically lower the scale of people who have the potential to take part and magnify terrorist actions. So therefore, we essentially are this uniquely prevent a huge danger to society, and we believe that essentially helping society be safe from the spreading of terrorist actions, especially to youth through social media, and essentially allowing them to be safe from magnified actions of terrorism through deterrence. Since we stand for this, we believe that we should not decriminalize the act of joining or attempting to join terrorist organizations. And for these reasons, I'm proud to oppose.
In the UK, a 15-year-old joined ISIS under the coercive and deceiving narratives that she'll be promised a better life, only to become a child bride, abused and oppressed within the system. Opposition is the team telling the victim that there's no recourse to the mistake that she made as an immature child, despite being manipulated and being subject to horrors within the system. Before that, extraneous rebuttals. Firstly, on the push that essentially they're going to dismantle terrorist organizations through deterrence. 4 layers of response. The first issue I identify here is that the signposting suggests a solution or recourse to the grievous nature of terrorist organization, but the mechanism only comes in 1 or 2 sentences where essentially the term deterrence is being used very liberally. All they provide essentially is framing and characterization. But just because they are extreme does not mean that they are automatic solutions into criminalizing them. We told you that it is not an effective deterrent because, firstly, anti-terrorist narratives is something we can co-opt. The government can convince people not to join because of the realities by countering, the certain propaganda that they already employ. Secondly, despite all of these measures, people who joined are probably going to be extreme. What that means is that individuals who commit crime, so like incapacitation, is essentially like the push coming from them. But the framing here is that most people who this debate directly affects are people who are voluntarily leaving terrorist groups because they are subject to horrors. But let's say being charitable, that there are people who get caught in the middle of action. Rehabilitation programs probably exist, but secondly, sanctions that are not limited to criminalization probably exist. This doesn't mean locking them up in prison, but in the interest of national security, there's probably going to be security measures, monitoring, etc., meaning we don't need to engage with the fact that people are going to, recommit crimes in our world. The value of rehabilitation triumphs the value of retribution because retribution loses value given that our framing on people being coerced hasn't been properly knocked down, meaning that in terms of probability, this is much more likely than 2 sentences of framing that opposition gives. I want to burden push before I move on to my the rest of my rebuttals. On closing, because I know that there are certain things that are going to be derivative. Firstly, on principle, i.e. on the justifications of a proportional punishment due to people being complicit within a crime. Secondly, they have to push a practical, i.e. how they can structurally reform action against terrorism, because I don't think OO did this substantively enough. Alex pushed this claim. I think they don't have any method of recourse. If they don't prove why alternatively they can get recourse, they lose. 2 things they need to prove. Firstly, opposition's winning line has to be that all levels of practical delta, i.e. dismantling the organization, happens at the expense of the principle we pushed. What this means is that they need to prove how and why, to what extent they can structurally dismantle the organization by criminalizing the underlings, essentially the people who joined from the bottom of the ladder. The reason why they're likely to be on the bottom of the ladder is assuming that they were from previously established institutions. Terrorist groups are not going to trust these individuals and promote them into high-ranking places, meaning they're more likely to be subject to violence, they're more likely to be subject to exploitation, meaning they're more likely to be the victims in these scenarios. Seeing that if that occurs, i.e. even if they do that, why is that then weighed above individuals who are coerced into being complicit within terrorist groups? We told you that this was the likely counterfactual. On principle, they need to also prove 3 things. Number 1, why people weren't coerced in the first place. Secondly, why mistakes are irrevocable and grievous in terms of how an immature 15-year-old can make a mistake and this is sanctioned 30 years down the line. And fourthly, why subjective severe sanctions would be justified over possible projections of delta in reforming action against terrorism. Before I move on to the rest of my engagement, are there any POIs? If closing can respond to that. 3.
Yes, I do have a POI. So if your whole dismantling contention is based on more people joining, doesn't this just mean more people becoming underlings, more people being abused instead of getting access to higher information?
I don't understand because that's not our point. We're not coercing more people into joining terrorist groups. In fact, that is counterintuitive if you think about it. Our mechanism is that individuals who are dropping out of the system, who have been subject to extreme levels of exploitation and manipulation, are likely to get rehabilitated on our side. I want to explain the mechanisms by which this can be effective in dismantling the perception of terrorist organizations. There's 4 layers of analysis to this. Firstly, this heavily undermines the martyr image that they propagate for themselves. Criminalization often fuels the martyr image that terrorist groups thrive upon, when potential recruits are being treated as criminals, which becomes essentially symbols of resistance in the eyes of sympathizers. I think decriminalization, on the other hand, portrays these individuals as misguided or vulnerable, which weakens the lucrative nature of the martyr narrative. Second layer of analysis is that this challenges recruitment tactics, where essentially this decriminalization creates an environment where tactics of recruiters can be openly discussed and countered by acknowledging that previous recruits might have been coerced, deceived, or targeted forwarded as opposed, so like the victim narrative, as opposed to being individuals who willfully joined for the purpose of actively perpetrating harms against the state. I think this tactic is effective in getting in any form of delta that is necessary in this debate. But thirdly, without the immediate threat of legal consequences, individuals who are initially drawn to these groups might be more willing to share their experiences, i.e. to explain what their thinking process was and why this was wrong, etc., to discredit the propaganda spread by terrorist organizations, which essentially forwards a counter narrative. And that is absolutely essential within the context that we're trying to push sort of counter narratives in regard to the propaganda that terrorist organizations are pushing. But lastly, I think this prevents radicalization amplification. What I mean by this is that criminalization amplifies the radicalization process by creating perceived grievances against authority. When it seems like the state is sanctioning you like unconditionally, where the state is being grievous, and to that extent, decriminalization removes this narrative, which reduces the appeal of joining terrorist organizations as an act of rebellion against oppressive systems. I think this interacts well with what Alex told you, because we way above opening opposition from the start. Is that there's no recourse, because when being in a situation when criminal charges are forwarded, people who would want to leave terrorist organizations in status quo cannot effectively leave. They're actively, pushed away by the state and the institutions in power. They're effectively deterred from doing so. We told you that intelligence was absolutely crucial in saving more people's lives. The mechanism I forwarded as extension does so. For those reasons.
Before I move on to my rebuttal, before I move on to my substantive, I'd like to provide new pieces of frame and characterization, because note that essentially OG's case is like essentially framing all terrorists or like these people we're talking about in the debate as like victims. We tell that's simply not the case, because that's only a small amount of like people who are actually engaging in these terrorist actions, right? We tell that essentially they're generalizing all the types of people who actually do choose to join these terrorist groups. But secondly, I'll be moving on to how essentially the major push they give is that essentially they're being able to dismantle these criminal organizations. They're able to gain more intel. They're going to be able to, for example, prevent more people from being harmed in the future. I'll firstly prove to you why this is like not really that exclusive in my own like rebuttal. But first, secondly, I'll prove to you why this actually backfires under their side of the house, right? Firstly, regarding the framing and the characterization, note that after like essentially depicts them as victims, we tell that that's simply not the case, right? The mechanisms they give you, or like essentially the major types of people they're focusing on are, for example, like 14-year-olds, 15-year-olds coerced by like essentially like relatives or like people or like essentially better future into joining the ISIS, etc. I would tell that's not like essentially the whole case. For example, for people living in oppressive regimes, like they have characterized themselves, we don't see how this debate really change anything, because if they're really oppressed by like, for example, the government, the very government oppressing them, we don't see how likely it is for the government that are like actively oppressing them to actually be lenient and actually provide them with like better rehab, or like essentially all of these like mechanisms that they provide, or like the benefits they provide for like these people, right? But secondly, so for example, this looks like, for example, the terrorist activities or like groups happening in the Middle East, given like their political dynamics. We don't see how this debate will actually change like on either side of that, like will actually impact them on either side of the house, right? But secondly, are people actually being oppressed in like their side of the house, right? For example, we're talking about the cases of like the rising white extremists, in the case the rising the rising right extremists in, for example, Western states like US, Europe, etc. This looks like, for example, Islamophobic actions, for example, anti-immigration, racist actions, etc. We don't see how they're really being oppressed by the regime, because all the time we see that they're extremists and they're essentially terrorists because they're actively trying to harm someone else for their own belief, for their own essentially religious beliefs, or for their own ideologies, right? So we don't really see how they're really victims, because in this case, if they're willing enough to join these essentially terrorist groups that are willing to transcend the bonds of, for example, human morality, transcend the bonds of legal like essentially norms, etc. We don't see we feel like they're going to be really essentially indoctrinated by such ideas, and we don't see how it's really easy for you to actually rehab them because of how extreme they are, right? But secondly, regarding the like main like bulk of their case, regarding the benefits of like dismantling the terrorist groups and essentially how they provide the exclusive rehab, right? Two responses under this. Firstly, regarding the point of rehab, we don't see how rehab is really exclusive, because in the status quo with the case of prison, in the prison system or like in the justice system, rehabilitation is a part of the prison system, right? Even if, let's say, they get better rehab, we really doubt how this rehab will actually work, because like I've said it previously, right? If these people are willing to join such groups, if people are willing to join such terrorist groups, essentially, despite, for example, human morality, or despite all the legal norms, despite, for example, all the backlash they themselves must know before they actually join, we don't see how this essentially, we don't see how rehab or like telling them, oh, it's bad for you to like harm people. We don't see how this will actually work onto their side of the house, and they never really provide any like essentially examples or like provide more essentially detail as to what these rehab will look like and how this will actually be different from what is happening in the status quo. Because OG, like Prime Minister themselves has stated, like these rehab or say for example these early prevention essentially activities already do exist in the status quo. For example, in the case of Denmark, even if we do not actually decriminalize these actions, right? But secondly, regarding the case of how this will be able to like dismantle like for example criminal groups, and they will be able to, for example, gain more intel. Firstly, we tell you how this backlashes, because now if criminal organization knows that, for example, the government is like decriminalizing this act, which means that it, like unstable members or like members who are like essentially swaying side by side, or like members who are like not like very yet indoctrinated by their idea, is able to, for example, provide intel to the police, to the government, and essentially take down the whole organization. Firstly, we don't see how they'll like actually like be willingly like let their secrets spill, which means that, for example, this looks like they're going to be more threatening, or essentially treat like these new recruits harsher, or for example they have like stricter essentially programs or like stricter methods or like things they follow in order to actually recruit. But this means that they will no longer be recruiting like random 14-year-olds, 15-year-olds from like UK to join the ISIS based on coercion. This means they're actually going to be recruiting like youth that are like really passionate, youth are like willing to die, like willing to die, or like no thank you, youth that are like really actually passionate about these things. These new recruits onto their side of the house are no longer going to be very naive, very essentially easily influenced like children or like teenagers on their side. That means that these recruits are going to be essentially more indoctrinated, they're going to be more extreme, and essentially harder to actually get the information out of, right? But secondly, Judge, even if you don't believe this, we tell that this already happens in the status quo under our side of the house, because in the justice system, although it's like quite different, it means that, for example, we already have bargains, as in like if you provide more information about this organization, then essentially we'll lessen your charge, we'll like not let you go to jail. And secondly, if we're really talking about, for example, 14, 15-year-olds like joining ISIS, etc., we don't see how firstly like are they even like criminally are they even like legally essentially just for like charge? And secondly, with like the court under our side of the house is not like a hardline ban, right? It's not like if we like catch you, we're gonna put you in jail for 20 years. Yes, I'll take a POI.
Even the most indoctrinated individual is a victim to terrorist groups' propaganda.
Okay, I'll also be expanding on this, right? Because those victims are not the only victims of society. You're essentially doing a trade-off where like we provide like benefits, or like we value the rights of these victims over, for example, the rights of like the future victims from like more future, for example, 2005 London bombings, or more like victims of like future mass shootings, or like etc. We tell the government has the obligation to actually value the rights of these public over, for example, these victims, right? Because everyone's a victim in this case, right? But moreover, we tell the court under our side of the house, like in the status quo, it's going to be lenient, right? Because like essentially it's not a hardline ban. It's like it's really like essentially blurry, and like depends on the case. For example, if you're really coerced, we don't see how like the court will obviously decide what like type of punishment, or like for example how like bad it is, or like how bad the situation is, based on like what actually happens, and based on, for example, their age, their conduct, like their ideology, and like what actions they have to actually engage in. It doesn't mean like everyone under outside the house, the victim they're talking about, is going to like go to jail for 20 years and actually be like a social recheck for the rest of their lives and like rejoin these terrorist organizations in the future, right? But now lastly, regarding like a really small like substantive point of like social messaging, we tell that this on the side of the house, they're going to gain like public backlash and international backlash from like the own people, and for example from the global community, because what other people see is that these governments are essentially condoning these actions, or condoning youth joining, like for example ISIS, joining Taliban, or like joining these organizations that are like essentially the synonym of like, for example, terrorism, or like synonym of like death, destruction, of like harming like, for example, innocent people of like society. And for these reasons, we tell that firstly, we tell you why their case actually backfires, because this means that these criminal organizations are going to be even more secretive and essentially harsher on new recruits, and these recruits are no longer going to be naive, innocent, like 15-year-olds like they have characterized. And secondly, we tell you like how like non-exclusive their case is. And for this reason, I'm very proud to
The standard of what decriminalizing looks like and what joining or attempting to join these terrorist organizations is extremely unclear, and rather would lead to further harms. There is a blurry and unclear line that is drawn between what should be criminalized or decriminalized in today's debate, which I'll further elaborate to, never am proud to propose. Moving into my clarifications, Judge, joining or attempting to join the organization itself doesn't mean that they caused or committed a crime itself. Let's make this clear. CG wants to Sejong wants a state where rather law enforcement resources could be more effectively directed towards investigating and preventing actual criminal activities associated with terrorist organizations, such as law violations or whatnot. The ultimate meaning or very definition of criminalizing something is when someone has inherently harmed the people, like Jogsu, or if that person has harmed the third party. Let's focus on the fact that the majority of laws criminalize people when they have done something, but not when they are suspected or potentially can do something. Let's rather focus on the present, not on the future, right? Central to the principles of a just legal system is the presumption of innocence. Individuals should not be treated as criminals based on suspicions or potential harm to commit a crime or not. Treating someone as guilty before they have actually committed a crime contradicts the fundamental idea that a person is innocent until proven guilty in criminal justice. We will punish the people who cause such illegal actions or harming other ones or themselves, but not the ones who didn't do such actions or whatnot. And also, like our OG mentioned, there are incentives of individuals joining terrorist groups in their intricate ideologies. Acknowledging these incentives can inform target intervention strategies aimed at addressing the main motivations of the criminals itself, these individuals itself. Also, it's once more note the fact that side op just completely neglects and excludes the people who have caused a mistake or due to the undirected incentives, which makes rehab necessary when op doesn't tackle the core problem and incentive. Moving into my rebuttals for the OO. First of all, they mention about people would not want to go to prison or get punished, so they would be dissuaded from going into the organization or attempting to go into the organization itself. So their responses. A, this argument only embraces some parts of the complex dynamics about radicalization. It is ineffective when dealing with the intricate interplay of physiological or ideological social factors of these individuals and stakeholders. Those ideologies that the other side claims to be erratic or extremist might view the potential reward of joining a group as far more enticing than the risk associated with the punishment itself. For some, the prospect of imprisonment would even be seen as a testament to their dedication to what they perceive as a righteous cause or not. B, relying deterrence doesn't step on the main incentive in the first place. Individuals attempting or joining terrorist organizations are often motivated by a sense of injustice or personal ideologies, like the other side has framing also conceded to. Deterring them through fear or punishment fails to address the underlying catalyst, and to address this, alternatives must encompass a multi-phase approach that includes not only deterrence, but also effort to address grievances and also provide alternative pathways for expansion. By acknowledging the complex motivations that fuel recruitment, societies can develop more comprehensive solutions that genuinely tackle the roots of extremism. 2, they talk about it prevents potential or further terrorist organization causing harm because they are extreme people into the society with erratic ideologies. However, note that relying solely on punitive measures may alienate this individual from the society in the first place, making it harder for them to abandon their ideologies that are extremist beliefs and contributing to psycho-radicalization. Instead, we should focus on fostering an environment that encourages growth, provides alternatives, and addresses the root causes of their involvement can yield more lasting results. Comprehensive reintegration strategies recognize that dismantling extremist ideologies requires a long-term commitment or rehabilitation to change and offer a more sustainable solution to prevent further harms. By combining deterrence with meaningful support and rehabilitations, societies can work towards preventing further radicalization and reintegrating those who have already been drawn into these ideologies or whatnot. Moving to further extensions on the arguments brought out by our opening side. First, under the argument of rehabilitation. Our side of the house would put our central viewpoint on rehabilitation rather than immediate punitive measures. Society can adopt a more comprehensive and inclusive measure and forward-looking strategy that aims to reintegrate individuals into mainstream society and mitigate the potential harms they could pose. We recognize that individuals who express an interest in joining terrorist organizations could be vulnerable to manipulation, coercion, or ideological beliefs and doctrines. Instead of treating them solely as threats to national security, the rehabilitation approach aims to understand the underlying factors that led to them getting interest in such terrorist groups or whatnot. We could look to the individual's background or motivation to create rehabilitation solely for that person itself. These plans would take into account physiological, social, and ideological factors that could address the root causes of their attempts to join these terrorist organizations itself. This understanding forms the basis of designing targeted intervention programs that addresses the root causes of radicalization, whether they stem from personal grievances, a lack of social integration, or whatnot. Moving to second, the OG talks about prevent actions of criminals, and I like to further elaborate the points that they missed out in their mechanization. Decriminalizing the act of joining or attempting to join terrorist organization could foster an environment of cooperation where individuals are more likely to share information about these groups without the reason of legal repercussions or being scared about it and being disincentivized due to this. This incentive for cooperation will lead to more information getting gathered by the institution itself and enhancing law enforcement for recruitment tactics, ideological appeals. Individuals who previously hesitated to come forward or like to talk about the terrorist organization itself due to potential criminal charges would have higher incentive to share their experiences and contribute for a broader understanding of activities within the terrorist group, leading to further potential information getting shared out to the public. This approach will be done by having careful checks to distinguish genuine cooperation from malicious intents that the individuals could have while attempting to do this. So, having that said, moving into our team's last Moving into our team's substantive argument. First of all, how does this give justifiable punishment? Determining whether a person has in fact committed a crime, rather than punishing them solely for their ability to commit a crime, the essential principles of criminal justice and fairness are to be valued. This concept is clearly illustrated through various scenarios or examples in today's society, such as when people join in criminal organizations or in terrorist organizations or not. In the field of criminal justice and in the principle, profiling individuals solely on the basis of characteristics suggestive of future criminal activity undermines equal treatment and due processes. An understandable and justifiable legal system requires that criminalization occurs when there is a sufficient credible evidence of actual criminal activity, thereby preventing unjustifiable deprivation of liberty. Adopting a system that respects this fundamental right unless there's clear evidence of inciting violence or harm, or if they did actually harm some third party or themselves, will preserve an environment in which ideas can flourish without concern. Let's note once again that our society should prioritize the actions that are already committed rather than the potential actions to ensure that justice is respected and individuals are treated fairly based on their behavior. We shouldn't charge or criminalize someone because of the fact that they just attempted to join an organization or not, without looking through the incentive that could have been the reason why they joined the terrorist organization itself. And we should have this clear in order to keep the very principles of criminal justice and the reasons why we accuse some people for criminalization and why we decriminalize individuals. And for these reasons,
So today, Upper House and Gov especially focuses on the aspect of people who are innocent trying to leave terrorist organizations. However, there are several more aspects of the motion we should discuss about. Namely, first, people actually joining the organization, which is what the law is actually about. Second, how the terrorists will actually react, which is, vastly missing from the debate so far. All right. So first, just going through some pro points. Gov tries to portray these people who join terrorists as victims. They gave out several instances why this might happening. They say they might be lured by wealth. They might be felt by ideology. They might be driven by structural issues. However, notice that their sole solvency of this rehabilitation is not explained at all. There is no mechanism, right? We say that rehabilitation makes no sense at all because it does not prevent these people from joining again, right? We say that these people should be punished by law, should be preventing them from actually committing harm once more. Because if you join a terrorist organization once, you're more likely to do it again, right? If they're lured by wealth, what's to say that after rehabilitation, not yet, they will not be lured again, right? If they're felt by ideology, then they're already potential terrorists, right? If you hate the government, you're going to hate the government no matter what, right? You're releasing potential terrorists back into society, which is a massive safety hazard, right? Lastly, structural issues, right? Our opponent provides no solvency on the structural issues whatsoever. They're basically just throwing these people back into the slums where they came from, except now they're exposed to terrorist ideologies, which has radicalized them and make them more likely to commit violent acts that are harmful to people, right? Now the question begins is it actually moral to punish people who are just a risk to society, contrary to actually committing acts that has harmed society? The answer is a resounding yes. Judge, let's take a look at our current legal system today, right? Why are people why are people penalized for speeding on the highway? It's precisely because they are a safety hazard to people, right? Risk should be punished. Risk should be known, should be prevented, right? This is what opposition stands for today. Our opponent, yeah, sure, I can take this one.
Do you think people are coerced and tortured into speeding on the highway?
Our opponent, I do not see the relation here, right? You are not tortured and coerced into terrorist groups either, right? In your scenario, they're usually lured by wealth, they're ideally collected by ideology, or they're driven by structural issues, right? So in these three instances, first, we say wealth is lured by wealth is never a justifiable thing to say that you're innocent. I might sell drugs because I have no money, right? Is that the justifiable reason that I joined a drug cartel? Of course not, right? Ideology. Well, ideology means they're already half terrorists, right? We say that there is no justification for letting these people off the hook, right? And why is ideology a substantial fact to criminalize them? Well, simply because joining a terrorist organization is not the only way to express your dissatisfaction to society, right? There's a spectrum of protests. There are peaceful groups who are activists and trying to make a better society for certain groups in society, right? There are more radical peaceful groups like the neo-Nazis. Why are the neo-Nazis not terrorists? Because they do not do anything anything that actually harm people in a violent way, right? Choosing to join a terrorist organization is going all the way on the radical spectrum, choosing the most radical, most extreme, and most dangerous way to protest against society, right? And we say by making this distinction, by purposely sorting through the amount of like peaceful, safe organizations you can join legally in the current day, and choosing one that is so dangerous, so a threat to society, and so just morally wrong by the current societal narratives, then you already have enough grounds to be penalized by law. Right. All right. So onto their second contention about information, right? They said that, people will be more likely to come forward. However, this will actually I would argue this will actually cause structural change within terrorists that make them much more dangerous, that make recruits, much more heartfelt, right? Because like before, right, if you want to leave a terrorist organization, you'll be subjected to the legal due process. You'll at least be protected under law, right? The government will protect you, right? But if you decriminalization happens, the government has no legal obligation to try you, to arrest you, to send you off to prison, right? This exposes these people to terrorist retaliation, right? We say instead of letting terrorists who has no incentive to uphold morals or legal rights in present society, it is much better for these victims, as our opponent characterizes them, to be subjected under fair trials under due process, right? Because our opponents today and upper house keep neglecting what terrorists have the power to do, right? Terrorists are not just peaceful gatherings of people, right? They have substantial amounts of power of coercion, as our opponent said, right? If you join a terrorist organization, this does not mean you just sit in on meetings, you just sit in on tea parties, right? This means you're actively participating in acts of indoctrination, you're actively being more connected to the terrorist organization, and in turn, you're actually exposing people around you after this point, you're actively exposing people around you to threats of terrorism, right? Yeah, I can take that POI.
We proved why individuals who join terrorist groups from the bottom up are typically underlings who are instrumentalized as opposed to acting in their own will. They're coerced and tortured into committing acts of terror.
All right. So first, our opponent, you said that, I'm assuming you mean that joining terrorist organization is a bad act in the beginning. So first, again, more justification for criminalization, right? We do not want more people to join, right? What Gov is actually doing by decriminalizing this is decreasing the amount of risk of people face from the government by joining into terrorist organizations, right? You're pushing people who are teetering on the edge, indecisive because they might be penalized by law, into joining terrorist organizations, during which they'll be tortured, they'll be coerced into doing these acts, as you said. And, we say this is still justified because, again, by making that choice, by choosing the most radical, radical way to protest society on that spectrum, why can't they just join, say maybe a socialist party to protest society? Why can't they join the neo-Nazis, right? Even why do they choose terrorist organizations who actively done acts to kill, to harm, to injure others, right? We say by this choice, they're already subjecting themselves to a moral low ground, which can be penalized by law, right? Because again, risk should be penalized, risk should be prevented, right? There is a reason why speeding on a highway is penalized. There is a reason why, just causing general disruptions to society is penalized. And by them actively choosing this, they are subjecting themselves to being criminalized, right? So what Gov today is trying to tell us is that, these people are poor. They have no other choice rather than to join these terrorist organizations. We tell you this is simply not true, right? There's so many other organizations that have joined that are less dangerous, they are less, radical, yet they still made this choice. This makes them a criminal. So never been prouder to oppose. Thank you.
Criminalizing will lead to further polarization and radicalization between the terrorists and the society itself, leading to further harms, as well as a point where the standard itself is very unclear how to propose. Also, let's note that a main catalyst that makes people to get into terrorist association is ideologies and materials that the organization itself pushes. I'll prove three things in my speech. A, prove how OG failed to mechanize nor characterize what the standard looks like, and B, simply listing out assumptions that were never mechanized and backed up with proper logic, and see how CO is just repeating the case from OO without any mechanism whatsoever. Now let's further look at OG. So let's note that the open government never properly characterized the line between what should be criminalized and what should be decriminalized, which is drawn out by our first speaker. The difference between the difference between attempting and committing is huge, which should actually be a standard of decision. So there's too much mention about differentiate joining
joining the terrorist organization and taking action. But firstly, we don't disagree with OG. However, we believe that OG has never framework or set a standard of what this actually looks like, which our previous speaker MG has already well clarified. Secondly, the differentiation between individuals who join terrorist organizations and those who actively engage in criminal actions is rooted into two fundamental principles of criminal justice. By treating these two categories differently, the legal system upholds the principle of proportionality, of fairness, and due process. Recognizing that joining an organization may involve complex dynamics such as manipulation or misguided beliefs, and differentiation allows for a case-by-case assessment of intent and involvement. Lastly, the distinction serves a safeguard against potential overreach and injustice within the criminal justice system. Imposing penalties on individuals based solely on their association risk, criminalizing thought and association rather than proven actions. Moreover, adopting a differentiated approach provides space of restorative justice, rehabilitation, and reintegration efforts for those who have expressed an interest in extremist groups. And this balanced approach recognizes the need of accountability while also acknowledging the potential for personal transformation and societal reintegrations. So and their point about rehabilitation, two layers. A, rehabilitation centered on addressing the root cause behind individuals' involvement and extremist ideologies in a multi-phase process. It begins with a comprehensive assessment of their background, motivations, and psychological factors that contribute of their radicalization. This assessment serves as the basis of tailoring intervention strategies that directly target the specific drivers of their engagement, and psychological support form a different kind of counseling, of offering different kind of therapy to help individuals confront them and manage underlying traumas, mental health issues, and emotional vulnerabilities that played a role in their radicalization. And B, education plays a pivotal role in the rehabilitation process, focusing on promoting critical thinking, media literacy, and exposing individuals to diverse perspectives by offering a counter narrative to the narrow ideologies that drew them in the extremist group. And education empowers individuals to reevaluate their beliefs and making informed choices. And we believe that by this we believe that we mechanize better, and OG fails in today's debate. Second, their team has mentioned about government responsibility to protect citizens, leading to their logic about joining them takes so much risk. However, yes, it is true that we believe that their kind of responsibilities their kind of responsibility from the government should rather be mentioned by our bench, since we believe that it is the government's responsibility to deal with these kind of citizens, not to force them into jail without fully rehabilitating them. The OO cannot achieve rehabilitation to these kind of terrorists, especially using their logic that they would eventually commit a crime, which firstly didn't have any sort of mechanism whatsoever. Secondly, even so, just by going into jail and coming out won't lead to rehabilitation nor deterrence in the end of the day, which I'll also elaborate later, and rather lead to further polarization and rising radical ideas towards the government and the society as a whole for characterizing them as a criminal. Secondly, their team's point about physical deterrence will lead to their logic about better to put them in jail. Three layers. A, we don't buy this premise because your team is just assuming that physical deterrence will lead to a beneficial and a perfect utopia when this isn't true in the end of the day, just portraying in the status quo. We believe that the physical deterrence will rather lead to further harms or be ineffective in the end of the day. B, people, especially ones who have a bad intent, which would OO's case an assumption that they were pushing, for which I'll even deal with later, normally don't measure their punishment that they will get in the end of the day when doing these kind of actions. This means that even though the whole opposition bench tries to put these individuals into jail, so a so-called mechanism of deterrence isn't actually true and rather lead to polarizing impacts. Lastly, then why would there be polarizing impact? Since the government would be forcing people to go into jail even though they simply joined once, which is the status quo team opposition, they will lead to further radicalization among terrorists, leading to further harm. And then what will happen when we actually decriminalize? People will feel much better in the status quo, not really feeling nor pressure in the status quo, since they are characterized as illegal criminals, leading to less terrors or even deterrence at the end of the day. Lastly, about their point about no guarantee that they won't do this in the future, leading to their logic about high risk associated with these individuals. However, one clear response: even though we say that their premise is true, we believe that this is symmetrical, since the OO cannot even guarantee that they would be able to gain much deterrence, especially because they haven't mechanized this in their whole 14 minutes of speeches. By this, OO also falls into this debate. Lastly, CO. Their team's main point was basically ideologies are not the main incentive. However, two layers. Ideologies provides a framework that justifies and legitimizes the use of violence as a means to achieve certain goals. It can create a sense of purpose and belonging, offering individuals an revenue to express their frustration and perceived injustice. B, it is essential to recognize that the motivation behind joining extremist groups are often multi-phase and can vary from person to person. Ideologies act as a powerful catalyst that can amplify and channel other factors, such as personal identity crisis, social isolation, or economic hardships towards extremist actions. The symbolic relationship between ideologies and recruitment is evident in how these groups use ideologies to instill a sense of identity and community among their members. The shared belief system acts as a unifying force, making individuals feel connected to a larger cause and fostering a strong sense. In the context, the organization propaganda materials serve as a powerful tool for reinforcing these ideological bonds, perpetuating a cycle of radicalization. By this, CO falls, therefore proud to propose.
I'd first like to begin with some framing and move on to a few weighing and refutation. So first, terrorist organizations are called terrorist organizations for a certain reason. It is because of their radical, violent tendencies. Second, even if the coerced people do not do anything yet, they pose a significant risk to society and the people around them. The government have a responsibility to legitimately protect their citizens. And third, if coerced people are able to prove themselves on court, they will receive less penalty because the CJI system will not just punish everyone without close considerations like idiots. And now, in Gov's case, even if some of the people is coerced as they mechanized, if they can prove that on court, then the punishment for them won't be as severe. For example, they put them in jail for a very short time, but that is also for the reason to protect them, so terrorism won't threaten you and your entire family, and you can escape from terrorist control and manipulation without criminalizing them. The government will have no more incentive to protect these people by law, and they'll be just left there to deal with the terrorists themselves. And GovBench is pushing these people to stay inside the organizations and just leave more people to join. This form of criminalizing is legitimately protecting the coerced criminalized rather than punishing them unfairly. But what will change as an impact? We help the coerced individuals break from the terrorist organizations. And our burden in this debate is to prove we can solve terrorist problems better because it impacts the whole society, right? So secondly, criminalizing them incentivize people to escape from this area. Even if they're coerced, they contribute to the terrorists. They hide tracks, and it doesn't matter if they're on the top or end of the ladder. They make the terrorists harder to capture. And criminalizing them is an effective way to break the terrorist organizations by splitting away a lot of people they can use, which in the status quo is not effectively solved. And three, it won't be any better on the GovBench. If you don't criminalize them and keep them under the terrorist controls, they will be used to be shields, and they will be used to be suicide bombs by the terrorists anyways, and they'll keep being tortured. But deterrence incentivize them to fight back, or else there's no other alternative that we can see that GovBench provides. And in opposition, we change the people who have less incentive to fight back. We give them the incentive, and this is the most efficient way to crack down the terrorist underground system. And we give more people the incentive to actively escape. And principally, why is it justified to criminalizing them? Simply because they actively contribute to the destruction of thousands of lives. We also as we gave structural reason in our member speech, in our I'll take the POI right now.
The premise of the motion is criminalizing the act of joining, not pardoning significant acts of violence. Their contribution to the terrorist group is either marginal, if not a product of severe coercion. OG engages in both cases.
Well, as our member already gave you, you joined, but you had other if you want to if you're lured by money or you're being forced, you can join to you have other choices, other organizations to join, but not the most radical terrorist system. And also joining this the act of supporting such organizations are actively harmful, and the acts of joining, if you want to talk about joining, means that they're knowingly associating with terrorists, even in our worst case, which if they are not aware when they join this like a system that like, they're not clear what they're doing, they still are aware that they're doing something harmful to the whole society because they are associated with terrorists already the moment they join the organization. POI.
Then how are you going to solve the core problem of the people's ideologies, which is the main incentive of the people to take such actions or attempt to go into the organization itself?
I just like mentioned in my speech above that they like because we provide them like the deterrence, they'll have an incentive to like not like they know they will be punished by law, so they won't they won't have like much incentive to be like lured by others or manipulated by others to join the like organizations anymore, because they're clear by law that the law tells them that it like they will be like deterred if they join the organizations. And back to the like justification, the action is like it matters more than intent in this debate. This is also kind of a response to POI because like negligence and criminal act is directly causing the severe casualties, which means criminal act is the most important. Criminal act is the most important in this debate, and the acts of these people are very necessary because like their actions are necessary for the terrorist massacre. They enable the terrorist attack to successfully kill many people despite such abundant anti-terrorism resources. They're a factor of cause within the success of terrorists. They hide information and material. And just like what OG said, these people do not have a clear idea of what harm they're going to bring to the society when they're joining terrorist organizations. This is our worst case, but they're only like when they're only paying attention to like their own lives and they're forced to join and they fail to think morally, like and but like they're often like not aware of like how they're threatening the lives, but like and they will become regretful when they actually realize, but like they have like criminality out of negligence in this case anyways, and that's why we want to break them away from terrorist organizations also. And terrorist attacks have done a lot of harm to the public already. There are like anti-terrorism propaganda by media and government everywhere, and so the coerced people in terrorist organizations are likely to know what their actions mean, and they knew that their actions meant that a lot of people were going to die, and they're terrified, so it was an active moral choice that we were providing them. It's quite not possible that they have no idea at all of what they're doing because of the so many propagandas around. Wait, not now. And we're speculatives about the like analysis only works in limited instances and limited scale, but our principal argument about why these people have criminal culpability is more widely applicable, which is to say, sorry, 1 minute. Responding to OG, even if they're not effectively deterred, they should still be criminalized anyways. Therefore, it is not contingent on the practical outcome of whether the individual should be deterred, which means it is not as situational as O described, but universally applicable in all contexts. And OG asked us how we should deal with these people at the end of the ladder who are not likely to be put into big positions. And they gave us an example of a 16-year-old girl. Well, here's our response with 3 analysis. The first, their situation is not going to be any better if you don't criminalize them. Their example is literally one where terrorists take over the region and controls everything. So in this case, prisoning them and helping them to split from terrorist organizations is better than leaving them with the terrorists to die and be tortured and not be able to break. And second, their example is just not fitting because in their scenario, the girl is 16, so they won't be criminalized anyways. And the argument is untopical. And 3, even in other instances of coercion, if that's really highly coercive and they have no other alternatives, then even if theoretically they're criminalized, practically they won't receive punishment due to self-defense costs. So that's not even in this debate. The scenarios that are in this debate are people who are not highly coerced and who are actively making the choices and relying on the terrorists and actively helping the terrorists. Goffbench assumes that the CGI is to be rigid and so harsh to everyone without any specific consideration, which is just untrue. And so, Judge, we told you why protecting both the coerced individuals and society in general, and it is justified to do so. So proud to oppose, and thank you for listening.